What are the best existential novels of all time? Novels that can not only transform you, but make you a better person. And today, you guys already know, we're going to be talking about the existential classics, but I'm also going to be throwing at you some contemporary existential heat that you have maybe not heard of before. And my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best books and authors of all time. But more importantly, I show you guys how we can kick off a literary renaissance by being fired up about books again, by letting books not only passively enter our head as just information, but how to let information activate you. And that is one of my favorite parts about existentialism. I am no longer an existentialist, but back in my younger years, existentialism rocked my world, everyone. I was there, 14 years old, Shadow Ridge High School in Las Vegas, Mormons surrounding me on every side. And I was telling them all, you are not going to heaven or hell. We have to live for the moment. And they would roll their eyes and say, what? Joseph Smith said there were elephants in South America. But I was annoying. Yes. I went too far. Yes. I have evolved. But as a high school teacher right now, one of the biggest red pills I see my students have is when they get into absurdism, when they read The Stranger, when they become existentialists. It's not when they go back to religion or shove Red Dye 40 down their throats or take psychedelics. It has routinely been them confronting existentialism and the power inside that philosophy, because it is a liberating philosophy, especially if you have been constrained in your life. And this is why it can affect people at any point in their intellectual journey. I've always thought that if you've explored spirituality and knowledge with an open mind, then there is 100% chance at some point you had an existential philosophical crisis. Because I know many people who pitter-patter around philosophies because they believe in one thing and never actually live it. But if you are actually a seeker of knowledge, then you have to let it touch you, and you have to believe it, and you have to live it. And when you touch existentialism, it works. And so that's why I'm excited to talk about these novels today, because I know for me and tens of millions of others, it has ripped them away from the solid foundation that they thought they were on. Some of the time, it has made their life tumultuous, led them to addiction, death, or even worse things. But I would say many of the time, it has led them to a path not to just being a lifelong existentialist, but to shedding many of the unnecessary filters so that they can become a better human in the world. And so here we go. You're here for the novels. I'll get all my thoughts about existentialism out, throughout the presentation. So what am I going to pick first? Well, you guys already know. And maybe it's because I'm reading the Brothers Karamazov right now for the Right Conscious Book Club, like literally right before this. I was in the reality TV show, The Karamazovs Fighting. But the most direct work that deals with existential themes from Dostoevsky is Notes from the Underground. If you look at the Brothers Karamazov, or maybe like The Devils, which I think I have over here, as a whole, and study maybe some of the more subtle themes, you can get more existentialism out of them because they are much, much longer. And Notes from the Underground, I think, is like, 150 pages. But for bang for your buck existential classics, Notes from the Underground is one of the best. And I have to say, you guys, when I read Dostoevsky, I feel bad that I'm not like a fool. Like, we've become so rational and so neutered because of technology and the suburban world we live in that we're not as dramatic as some of these old people. I know this is a novel, but I swear to God, from everything I've read in history and sociology and novels, that people back in the 19th century and before had these like major dramatic episodes and breakdowns, and they didn't really know how to define it. It just happened in public. And you had these crazy characters who had no help that were just existing. And that's what Notes from the Underground is about. And so I will not bore you guys with book summaries right now. Let's keep it real. Let's keep it G. Let's talk about existentialism within this novel. Go read this if you want the summary. Go watch some book review if you want that. So this novel was published in 1864, long before the term existentialism was invented. But nonetheless, what Dostoevsky was doing in this novel, especially in part one, was responding to the rational egoism of Western utopianism and Enlightenment ideals, which kind of had this promise that that any man that was educated enough would eventually choose the good. And, this is kind of funny because this is kind of one of my tenets of the literary Renaissance. But what happened with the Western Enlightenment and where they got things wrong was that they didn't understand that there are 4 different types of education. They thought that mental education could heal you. And the craziness of the first half of the 20th century proved that wrong with Stalin, Hitler, all these people just going crazy. Like they were all educated people with educated populations just killing people in mass. But they didn't understand there are 4 modalities of education: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And when you go back to those times, they had no idea of physical education and controlling the physical body. They didn't even know yoga and meditation existed. Same with spirituality. East hadn't met West yet. And many people had a very primitive view of Christianity, especially in the peasant class, and didn't know how to utilize it to help them. Because now I know people, and like from what I've studied in Christianity and from what I've done, is that there are actually ways now to utilize the teachings, not just Christianity, but all religions and all forms of spirituality to control yourself. And it's actually somewhat of a big part of the literature. And there, you could literally go online right now and find thousands of YouTubers in whatever sect of religion or spirituality you want, teaching you how to use it to be a better person. The same goes with physical education. The same goes with all the emotional education we have out there. Now we actually have enough for the first time in history for people to reach a baseline, unless they are an outlier, to be nonviolent, loving human beings. There is no more excuse anymore if you have an internet connection and you aren't the genetic outlier to not eventually reach that. But back then, these Enlightenment ideals and these people, these aristocrats thought that, that was possible just by sending everyone to school. And that's what we still think right now. Send everyone to school and that's all we need. I'm a public school teacher right now, high school English. We don't teach people anything. Honestly, you guys. Most kids that walk across stages can't read, can't write well, can't do math well, can't think well, and their minds are just warped by the things they've seen online and the people that they've been around. And we've spent over $100,000 and put over 10,000 hours of time into each of them. It hasn't really been working. And we haven't even taught them a lot of the other 3 principles of physical, emotional, and spiritual education, because that would be illegal. Johnny can't do judo. He has, I was going to say autism, but he has, I was meant to say asthma. Jeannie can't do meditation. She's a Baptist. Johnny can't learn about the healing power of Christ because he's a Hindu. That's illegal. Separation of church and say all this stuff. We can't, real education has no boundaries in terms of doing what's effective as long as it's not hurting somebody. So Notes from the Underground is about this underground man who has gone way too far. He is not a hero. He is the philosophical introverted trickster type figure. He's neurotic. He's self-loathing. He's cancels each other out, but this dude is lucid. This dude has thoughts that hit like an arrow. And so one of the main positions that Dostoevsky talks about is that reason cannot explain why people sometimes irrationally choose to suffer just to show their freedom. He knew, like Camus and Sartre, 80 years later, would, explain much more eloquently in like actual nonfiction treaties that man is not some calculating machine, that we are not some rational animal that can be controlled. Exactly. And so the underground man in here is a little bit more of a sad boy, a little bit more of a demented lit bro than the vision of Sartre and Camus, in the sense that he believes that consciousness is a curse, which is the most annoying. I deal with writers all the time, everyone. So if you guys don't know, I run the most active book club in the world over on my Substack. I also have literature courses, writing courses. I honestly think I actually do have an hour breakdown of this novel and some other existential classics over there. I do a lot of content over on Substack. For instance, this is what it looks like over there. I have breakdowns of Cormac McCarthy's first drafts, deep dives into writing. Here's my latest video, top 5 novels about conspiracy theories. I talk about becoming symbol literate. Here is our book club schedule. For the next 3 months, we read anywhere from 6 to 10 novels a month and meet up on them. I record all of the calls. I also try to get as many book breakdowns of the book club books we cover out. And so I will put the link down below if you guys are interested in joining. And if not, I have a bunch of free content on Substack. Your support over there means a lot because it's off this platform. It is independent. It is where the best readers and writers in the world are at. it is giving me the freedom to speak my mind about things that I couldn't speak about here without getting kicked off. And so if you guys enjoy this channel and what I do it even more so. That is the deep dives into content, writing, and other things over on Substack. So it would mean a lot if you guys supported me over there, like I said, with either a free or a paid subscription. And I would love to meet you guys in the book club. But I have spoken. So speaking of that, so I have spoken to countless readers, writers, throughout my years as a content creator, throughout my years in academia, as a teacher, running a writers group, and just getting to know people. And the most annoying people of all, let's just be honest here, everyone, are the consciousness is a curse people, because they just have no self-starting ability. It's terrible to be around that. Because as you can maybe see, I have a thread of optimism. I have a thread of energy. Speaking of Dostoevsky, I literally just read in the Brothers Karamazov that after 30, Ivan's like, I'm going to lose my love of life. And I'm like, dude, I'm 32 and it's increasing every single day. I want to help more, do more, and be more. And the last thing you need to be around is those energy vampires who are paralyzed, who just attack everything with the mind. And so this book is awesome because it's also a treatise of what you don't want to be like. Because we can maybe idolize Meursault in The Stranger, or maybe some of the other characters we're going to talk about. And why I love The Underground Man is that he knows what he's doing is taking him away from freedom. He is consciously choosing, for instance, to act in what Sartre calls the bad faith, which is when we lie to ourselves, to avoid the burden of freedom. But the underground man knows he's lying to himself and still does it anyway. And so I always like to mention this one in regards to existentialism, because this is the entire bucket. This is all the extremes at once. It's proto-existentialism, but nonetheless an awesome novel. I recommend it to everyone. Go check it out. If you already haven't, like if you have not read this one yet and you consider yourself a serious reader, then I do believe that you should be working your way through Dostoevsky's work. Like I have the Joseph Frank biography, which I read recently, that was over 1,000 pages. And right now in the Right Conscious Book Club, we are actually reading through all of Dostoevsky's works in 2025 and 2026 as a group, along with Thomas Pynchon and some other authors. And it's honestly just been astounding to me. Like, it's just, his work is really transformative stuff. And so moving on to our next existential author, or book, I should say. And so now I want to move into a modern book. And I know what I'm supposed to do in these videos. I know I'm supposed to deliver you guys The Stranger, Hermann Hesse. And don't worry, we will get to them all in a second. The classics. Because it's kind of odd that there isn't really, because Camus and Sartre would say, I never was an existentialist. Like, no one wants to be labeled anything, right? Like, unless you want to be a part of the literary renaissance, which makes you a literary crusader. Like, what's cooler than that? Calling yourself a crusader for books in the modern world. Let's go. But most titles that you are especially given by other people, like, it's kind of like, ugh. Because it's kind of shocking. I don't know if you guys have ever done this before. If you really want to become the underground man, you should go ask a bunch of people who are brutally honest that to describe you in 3 words. And I remember when I did this, people like random, shock jock, or like that wasn't the word, but something like that. Like, and I was like, oh, I was hoping for a kind and smart, like all these other things. But no, it's funny, and it's actually something interesting to do over time, because if you ask like 100 people, you will see what people's general thoughts of you are. Because objectively or subjectively, when we look at ourselves, it doesn't work as well if we get objective opinions from a group of others and collect that data. So cool thought experiment. But there really isn't an existentialist movement anymore. And now it's obviously branched out, and like we could call almost anything that's moody or somewhat darker or whatever existential. We could say Infinite Jest is an existentialist novel, or Yukio Mishima. We could sit and like warp the definition even if ever so slightly to fit it. And so with this next selection and some of the other modern ones I'll talk about later, I really don't feel like I'm stretching with it. I feel like if it was written back in the day, that's the tag it would probably be associated with. And so boom, there's the little intro. Let's hop into it. So this is Otessa Mosfeg's My Year of Rest and Relaxation. And this is kind of an odd selection for what I normally talk about, but I was in university from like 2013 to 2019 or something like that. And I was a very active reader, totally dedicated to books, even new stuff that was coming out. And this was a big deal, I think, in 2018 when it came out. And so, of course, I read it. And funny enough, a story I like to tell is that everyone I know who kind of got hit with existentialism, then continued it on as a philosophy and never evolved from it, are very sad people. You know, especially if they took a more nihilistic route. Like when I was at university, I met so many people, my fellow students in the humanities, who were on drugs, on antidepressants, were thinking of committing suicide, going into the psych ward, like all of this stuff. It was honestly wild that they were really the most unhappy group of people I've ever been around. The craziest people I've ever been around are people in the yoga community and spiritual community. But the saddest were definitely people who were just into reading and thinking all of the time, which is kind of crazy. So this is a New York novel, about this girl who's basically become an orphan. I should say a woman who's unnamed. She's successful, she's beautiful, and she has everything she needs. She's young, beautiful, wealthy now, and she's got an Ivy League degree and is respected in kind of the cultural, social scene of New York City. But she's basically done. She's basically feels like her whole life has been a lie. And I'm not going to spoil any of these novels. And if I do accidentally, it's going to be maybe one of the classic novels from like the 19th century or something like that, like Notes from the Underground. Like, go read that. Doesn't really matter. But the concept of the novel is that she says, you know what? I'm just going to sleep for an entire year. I'm just going to take a bunch of sleeping pills and medicate myself to sleep and not do anything. And so this one is interesting because it's almost like a prison sentence. The world is going on around her and she's choosing to reject it wholeheartedly. You know, 9/11 and all this stuff is happening and she's asleep. And she's having basic interactions with people and stuff. Her best friend, her ex-boyfriend, the doctor, the Michael Jackson type doctor giving her the pills. And so this, much like The Underground Man, is this idea that existentialism believes that freedom is something that we cannot escape. And if you don't have purpose within that freedom, life becomes unbearable. It sucks, especially if you're conscious of it. If you're just some NPC, like, and you're unconscious and you're just going through life, maybe that freedom or the weight of freedom doesn't matter. And so the protagonist, unnamed, embraces this and is like, yeah, that's cool. But instead of engaging the world like the Underground Man, she chooses to reject it, which I think is a really cool concept with existentialism and all this stuff, because when we look at Sartre and Camus and these people, this idea needed to happen. You know, when you look at like the evolution of philosophy, now philosophy is basically dead. It's become so micro and is not connected to the world and to transformation and anything that it really doesn't matter. You know, I really feel like philosophy has almost moved into like weird sectors of like personal development and like spirituality and stuff. But when you look at like, you know, Western philosophy and these ideas, like you could see there was a ping-ponging effect. Like, okay, we've gone deep into the church, and now in 20th century Russian society, people have rejected that church. So we have, you know, and same in Europe. So then we have people like Dostoevsky trying to revive it, and Tolstoy trying to revive it in this new way, or we have Nietzsche, we have all this. And then as we move forward, these world wars are happening and there's totalitarianism. And so people are finally realizing for the first time, because in the Industrial Revolution, their freedom, blah, blah, blah. And so it's all very almost logical when you look back in retrospect. But now our world is really odd because it's so superficial. Everything is so disconnected from any purpose and making any change. You know, Camus was out there writing, you know, anti-Nazi stuff with a pen name and being a part of the French Revolution and doing this and fighting for Algiers. Like, if you agree with that or not, like whatever. But many of us have different types of pressures now. We don't have these grand narratives like, you know, Fight Club. We don't have a big war to go and fight in. We have to deal with our identity, our thoughts, our success or lack of success, our femininity or masculinity. And that's why you're seeing there's so many crises in all these areas. Like literally, like millennials are in a crisis with having to work and make money and do all this stuff and do as good as their parents. We have identity crises with gender, race, and so many other little facets of our life happening right now that never happened before. And partially that's because people are executing their freedom to revolt against these standards. And so this novel is kind of taking that and doing it to the extreme. She's rejecting all of it. She's not even playing it. Like if someone says, oh my gosh, I'm rejecting my gender or something, or my femininity, I'm going to be more masculine. Like, okay, but she just is cancel by doing nothing. You just cancel out everything. And what's funny about this one is that if you think of like Camus, we'll talk about in a second, Meursault doesn't lie. He's like, yeah, I don't care about my mom. He's like, he's on the brink of death and he just continues to tell the truth. He has this just radical odd awareness. And so once again, this is the opposite choice. So we have Meursault with this awareness. Well, what's the other side? Well, it's just staring into the void. She sees that all these rituals are a bunch of BS. Because what happens when you choose freedom? What happens, and this is what happened to me. This is, I think, happened to a lot of you guys. What happens when you choose an existentialist revolt? You're like, okay, I'm going to do this. My life has purpose. And then you realize it's all just empty fucking rituals. It's your friendships. All these things are empty. Then what? And I've taken the path of love, integration, thank God for meditation and psychedelics. That will kick any existentialist ass. And a little spice of motivation. But for a lot of people, they see all this and they just reject it. And then things become not nihilistic, but weirdly postmodern. Because I feel like it's more of a existentialist postmodern idea to protest our reality by just not doing anything. Not being this, underground man who's fucking with prostitutes and everything that he does in that novel, but rather just totally hitting the disengage button. So now I want to talk about Ponty and his idea of embodiment. Because what's interesting about Ponty, Husserl, Heidegger, the ontology of phenomenology, the beingness of being, which had a nice little connection and correlation with existentialism. So in existential philosophy, Ponty said, and I'm just kind of riffing here, but this is mostly right. He says that our body is not some passive thing that we possess. Like, this is my body. But it's the site of embodiment, the site of consciousness, of placement, of, I don't know the right word, in the world. It's the HQ. The body is the medium where we go and confront meaning through. It's not some cage. It's not some thing that we're trapped in. And so a lot of this novel actually deals with the body and her trying to flatten her body and her consciousness just into an object itself. So this is also anti-phenomenology. And so throughout the novel, she starts to shut down all links between her life and the world. Music, light, all these different things she starts to get rid of them because they are tying her down to reality. And so I won't spoil everything. Like, the ending of this one is pretty weird, and like some of the conclusions, and it feels like The Stranger, and I'll just say 9/11 is at the ending of the novel, and what's her reaction going to be? I can't tell you. You're going to have to go read it to find out. So I don't know exactly, I do recommend this novel, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is, the greatest novel ever written, but I do think that you will like it. I mean, if you've been interested in what I'm saying and that you're an avid reader, I don't think you'll be mad if you read this one. And I think if you're into, especially, this is a video for existentialism. If you're into existentialism and you want a modern version of it and ideas exploring it that's been kind of modernized, and the writing's a little bit like more flowery and weird and progressive than obviously like Hesse and Camus and Sartre and stuff, then I would say that this would be a decent place to start, if not the best place to start. So now let's talk about The Stranger. And I will kind of run through some alternative thoughts on this that I never really hear people talk about. I did a full breakdown on the writing strategies that Camus does in The Stranger over on the Substack, if you guys are interested in that. I'll talk about some of the ideas here, but I do a full-on breakdown over there. Because it's actually shocking, because most people read this and they think that it's an easy novel to write. And it isn't the hardest novel to write. Like, if you had 10 years to either write The Stranger or Blood Meridian, there is a million times better chance that you'd be able to write this than that. But critics and readers have viewed this as a more blank and simple novel. And it's interesting enough that I'm putting it on this list because Camus didn't really view it as an existential statement. And I already know down in the comment section, I'm going to be excited when I see it. Most people don't watch these videos. They just look at the pics and move on. And they're like, oh, and then someone's going to say, The Stranger isn't an existential novel, even though I'm saying. Sartre did call it that though. But what's interesting about this novel is it takes Northrop Frye's, I'm making a U right here, Northrop Frye's concept of the comedic U-shaped plot structure. So the novel is actually pretty funny when you look at it from different angles. But the beginning, Meursault is happy, right? He has his nice little life. He swims. He has these simple pleasures. Then he descends into misery. He murders the Arab. He has this trial. He's imprisoned. Then at the end, he has this weird, ironic awakening again, this kind of existential awakening where he finds peace. And so why this is an existential novel is that Meursault, the main character of the novel, only experiences. He doesn't judge or explain what he feels. For instance, Sartre said that the heroes, I'll put it on screen for you guys. The heroes of Hemingway and Caldwell never explain themselves, do not allow themselves to be dissected. They act only. Some have said they were blind and deaf, that they allowed themselves to be buffeted about by destiny. This is false and unjust. On the contrary, each of their spontaneous reactions is complete. What would be in real life something that lives and does not contemplate itself. And this is Jean-Paul Sartre on The Stranger. And so what's interesting is that a lot of people have read The Stranger and have idolized the simpleness of Meursault and his freedom, his existentialism, all these different things. But in actuality, that isn't what Camus was trying to say, because Camus says of this technique of having Meursault have no interiority, that quote, "But the technique of the American novel seems to me to lead to a dead end. I use it in The Stranger. It is true. But this was because it suited my purpose, which was to describe a man with no apparent awareness of his existence. By generalizing this particular technique, we would end up with the universe of automatons and instincts. It would be a considerable impoverishment. That is why, although I appreciate the real value of the American novel, I would give 100 Hemingways for one Stendhal." And that quote's always really stuck with me. And that's why I literally have it on the go in some folder of mine for situations like this, because what he's saying about Stendhal is that he would rather have one dude who actually has access to his emotions than 100 dudes who are rejecting interiority, which how I've seen many people practice existentialism in their life, especially when they get it, is as a means to, through their freedom, actually reject a moral responsibility or actually deeper contemplation. And this is why many younger people who read this novel, and I've seen this happen a million times, you guys, I should put The Stranger back up. With the Stranger, I've seen countless students read it before, and they have this awakening where they feel, maybe they get a little thus spoke Zarathustra in there too, that they can do whatever they want and there are no limits, and that they should cut off and objectify themselves. But in actuality, I don't really feel like that's true. Well, I just don't feel like it's very healthy. And so what's interesting is, if I wanted to play devil's advocate here, do you guys feel like Meursault has reached the level of consciousness to be able to consciously rebel, thus making him an existentialist? And so is this really an existentialist classic? Because I throw it into that category because it is actually a really, really good novel. And I've made videos on it that are an hour long, and I think about it all the time. Because we could argue that Meursault rejects the rituals, much like the last novel that we talked about, of love, of his wife, of having to mourn his mother. He rejects all these things and chooses something else. And, at the end, one of the bigger existential points is that he is condemned for his, not for his crime. The lawyer's like, you're fine, man. You might go to prison for a while, but you'll be fine. He's condemned not because of his crime of killing this Arab dude, but because of his indifference toward his mother's funeral and the murder and the rest of his life. The one thing that we cannot handle as a society, as we've been talking about, is indifference to the rituals and the simulacra that we all currently worship, our consensual reality. And it's still like this. We think that we are so open-minded because people have green hair, or that you're a Christian in a wicked world or whatever, but in actuality, we are, slowly heading into more closed-mindedness, because actual rebellion is becoming less and less possible. Really rebelling in this society right now is a very interesting prospect, and that looks like rejecting many aspects of technology, rejecting so many different things. And so I like this too, that he's not just, Meursault isn't just indifferent to society, but to God, to justice, to these, kind of so-called staples of society. And so then at the end of this novel, and sorry, I'm just kind of spoiling it, everyone should go and read it. This is like 100 pages. I read this in you can read this in under 2 hours, unless you're just like slow reading. At the end, as he is, about to be executed, he accepts freedom without having to have hope. And that's what kind of liberates him. He doesn't need to appeal to God, to the priest, to anybody. And so it's a little bit different because Meursault is basically saying yes to nothing. He's not really revolting, which I think, when we look at existentialism, that's some of Sartre's kind of inner socialist Marxism, like starting to flower, before he really went off that deep end. But nonetheless, like I said, I love this novel. I think it is an existentialist classic. It has to be on this list, but it can be interpreted in many different ways. And because of Meursault's state of consciousness, it may not be the best example. So next we have Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre, which is kind of like the existentialist text, even though it's not for sure the most popular one. So this novel is about a historian named Roquentin, who is basically having an existential crisis and losing his place in the world. But instead of him going mad and like having an existential crisis that we think of, he is starting to get more awareness, which is what kind of it happens when consensual reality starts to break down. When you have these existential crises, if you have a good base behind you, if you have some support and you have some of the baselines I was talking about earlier in place, a lot of the time you just get more freedom. A lot of the time it's actually really good. And that's why it becomes addicting, actually. So this is actually kind of can connect to postmodernism stuff. When you start to go down this path of freedom, sometimes people go way too far, and that freedom can be very detrimental because it feels awesome. We've all been there before when we lift a weight off of our shoulders of some belief that everyone else or whatever believes in, and we just leave it behind. It's awesome. But at some point, we have to have that stability, or we are going to end up like Icarus. We're going to fly too high to the sun, or fly too close to the sun, excuse me. So Roquentin, or however you say his name, Roquentin, yeah, I'm going to say it like that, is experiencing nausea, like physically, but also spiritually throughout the work. Like he's seeing that none of these objects, this book, this desk, really have any essence. He's starting to see things in only pure matter. And so this is Sartre rejecting the idea of essentialism, that things have fixed identity, or that humans have a nature, for instance. And Sartre said that existence precedes essence. So throughout Sartre's work, especially in Being in Nothingness and then in here, he talks about how there is no divine plan. There is nothing tethering us to human nature or any of that. It's just us. And so eventually Roquentin strips away enough that he realizes at the base of his soul is just freedom, as we've already been talking about. All he has is his choices. And this is he has his personal development moment that he has no excuses left. And that's a horrific thing, guys. When you actually, as a man or as a woman, shout out to all the women listening. You guys only make up 10% of the chat, or of the viewers. Hello. When you have that moment and you take personal responsibilities for your actions, it was the most radical change I ever made in my life. Jocko will say extreme ownership for everything except the killing of innocent people in Iraq. And so this is what separates, and this is why I like the nuance, is that the 20th century is filled with a lot of bleak novels, a lot of nihilistic novels, but Jean-Paul Sartre and even Camus aren't that. They're not saying that nothing matters and this all sucks. You have to live with your choices, and you have to, make these things matter. And so Sartre's trying to show us the process, the dark night of the soul, because he believes that until you feel the tear of actual being, as Rilke would say, that if you actually saw angels for what they were, you would die because of how terrifying they are. Until you do that, you can't act authentically. And this connects to everything I've discussed on the channel ad infinitum, that one of the best ways to spiritually evolve, and this couldn't happen until the East met West, is objecthood, is focusing on one thing and releasing all of your biases. In Christianity, this was the focus on the sacred object. That's why, focus on the sacred object. Like that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to strip away all biases and see something clearly. But what the people in the West didn't realize in art and the systems of mysticism in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is that there are levels to the game, that there are levels to actually being able to see clearly that shamanism and, Eastern religions figured out at a much deeper level. Just like how there were things that the East didn't figure out that the West had figured out. And that's one of the big ones, though. And so that's one of the things that actually made phenomenology real in the West, because existentialism, phenomenology, the Indians knew this shit thousands of years ago. This was already figured out. But for us, we had to codify it into Western philosophy. We had to somehow fit it into our system. And once we gained access to that information, we were finally able to do it. Same with the unconscious. The unconscious has been a thing. The Greeks knew about the unconscious, but Eastern philosophy and Eastern thought had been grappling with the unconscious for a really long time. Another thing I like in this novel is like its focus on language. That language is also a medium at some level that programs us, that we can lose contact with, and that can liberate us, because many of the things that we've been programmed with have been through language. Words, we put spells on each other with our words. You can see what words do to people. Watch someone who's invested into the Republican or Democratic Party. Look what words do to them. And so Sartre basically argues is that if there is no essence, then words can't really capture what's going on. And this is why Roquentin, who is this historian, basically abandons what he's doing. It's all history is just a lie that we're being told his story so that we don't have to confront ourselves and our own freedom in the moment, which, that's why I like this novel. This is really transformative stuff. If you actually let this touch you and actually believe this and actually experience that terror, you will remember it. That's why they call it the existential crisis. When you actually confront life, it is a crisis, because how do you reformat? And a lot of people don't. And some people don't reformat at all, and some people just go further into sleep. They just give up completely once that happens. They take a year off, as in the other book. And so I do like this novel. I haven't read it in 7 or 8 years. I read it for the first time in high school and then came back to it. It maybe will be on the list to read again, but I like the principles. And like I said, I feel like a lot of this stuff is needed. If you haven't explored this stuff, really good. So next we have Zorba the Greek by Nikos Konstantinos, Konstantinos. I'm hopefully saying that right, but we'll just say my boy Nikos throughout this novel. So this is actually one of the more positive, life-affirming novels that we're going to be talking about today, like the Nausea, all this stuff. Let's take a break from that. Let's take a year off. Wait. And so instead of retreating into intellectualism like we're going to see in Hunger and other novels that we're going to talk about and we've already heard about, this is about just plunging into life itself, really living this out. And that's why I like this novel. It is very action-oriented. And this is actually kind of a satire on intellectualism, because it's about some dudes trying to write a Buddhist manuscript, which, funny enough, I was just talking about that, right? How all this stuff is more Buddhist. And it's a good kind of dialogue between the thinker and the embodiment. So what Zorba the Greek really is doing is showing the duality of living an existential life, or actually playing these things out. And so, Zorba the Greek is weird because the story is basically this experience of life. And then when tragedy hits Zorba, what he does is dance. Someone dies, we dance. Nietzsche said that when someone, if you don't dance every day, then you're not truly living. It reminds me of Laura Palmer's dad in Twin Peaks. He just starts dancing after he's raped his daughter and killed her and all that stuff. And I like this because it is a physical education. It's talking about the body. We don't have to take this leap of faith like Kierkegaard or all this stuff. We just have to, and literally, you hear the word embody, phenomenology of ontology, the beingness of being. Well, it really is the body that is the driver of this. That the body is the medium, and we're all slunched all day, shoving Red 40 down our gullet. Then what the fuck is coming out on the output? It's something not good. And so the narrator is watching his friend Zorba basically live this life and live this way, and he's slowly transformed by it. He's a logic bro. Everything is an abstraction. Everything is a rational game. And that's why I like this, is that it's a big change. This is what you can do. This is about being electric in real life. If you live this mentality, you can wake people up. It's a slow game. Honestly, you guys, you don't just wake people up like that. It takes years to get people who are close to you to do that, but it's out of love. That's one of the things that the brothers Karamazov kind of teaches, is that through time, love others, give that, help them escape this crazy world of rationality or sensuality or whatever, and eventually you can heal them. And so this novel is really fun. I recommend this maybe more than any of the other ones if you haven't read this one yet, because like I said, it's practical and it's really something that everyone should take a part of. It's kind of like proto Tom Robbins. Very, like I said, I like these life-affirming novels. I think that they are harder and more important to write than all this tragic shit that we are talking about. And speaking of tragic novels, the next one on our list, that is a tragedy. So we have Knut Hamsun's Hunger. And what really blew my mind about this novel now in retrospect is I first read this at Utah State University when I was 18. And it was actually translated by my favorite author of all time, who is not a fiction author, who never wrote fiction in his life, Robert Blythe, the poet and nonfiction author. And he actually translated this novel, and then it got retranslated later on. But I just thought that it was funny. I had no idea who he was. And the first time I read it, it ended up being the only piece of fiction this poet who I fell in love with translated. And so I've talked about this one before over in my top Norwegian videos of all time. So anyone who's into is Norwegian or whatever, I did, I think, a top 10 list on Norwegian authors like a year ago. So this, once again, and this is a theme with existentialism, this novel features an unnamed narrator who's also somewhat unreliable, who's wandering the streets of Oslo, and he's hungry. He's like literally starving, but he doesn't really care about that. He cares about the existential hunger, everyone, that is gnawing away at him. He is searching for meaning. That's all he wants, is to be able to tangibly grab something and let it fill his soul. And so this is kind of one of these hyper-conscious, stream of consciousness type of novels. It is hallucinatory. It has a lot of inner monologues in it. And so this is a sad novel. You know, this is like the underground man, but who actually still cares and is a little bit more desperate and actually wants to be helped, but no one is kind of willing to. And so the reason why that I put this one on the list is that, you know, I don't have as much to say about it right now, but I do know that this is a proto-existentialist classic, that I wouldn't read this one first, but when you have time, I always say to you guys that reading the rawest form, reading the progenitors of the movement is sometimes really good because they are not bogged down by many of the axioms, and thoughts that these other people have. Like Sartre was trying to be someone and do something. Same with Camus. Hamsun, not as much. And so this just literary, like from a historical literary perspective, is kind of one of the first real modern psychological novels. And so it is somewhat of a slog to get through. I remember reading it and kind of being like, but I do recommend it. And I do think it explores the themes of existentialism really well. And just, it really covers a lot of things we've already talked about. So I don't want to kind of just repeat the same things. But nonetheless, if that's what you're interested in, then this has to be on the list. So next we have Marilynne Robinson's Gilead, or Gilead, who knows? And this may be an interesting choice because Robinson is still alive and is also a pretty hardcore Christian Calvinist. So how the hell did she end up on this novel? But, you know, existentialism isn't necessarily tied to religion, and characters can still be having these existential moments, within a novel. So next we have Marilynne Robinson's Gilead, which may seem somewhat odd because she is a Christian Calvinist author, but Gilead, I think, really kind of fits this model because she is, I would say, one of the lineage holders of the Kierkegaardian existentialism line. Because Kierkegaard had this form of Christian existentialism that really focused on like how Christians struggle with their doubt, how to find like love and ethics in this broken, evil world, you know, and taking actual responsibility for your own faith and your own like actions in the world. And the novel deals with is all about death and what happens after death. It grapples with faith, and it was written from the point of view of someone who has no real assurance or certainty of life and what's going to happen, even though he is a Christian. And what's funny enough is that existentialism is actually mentioned in the novel at one point. One of the characters says, I'm not going to preach to you guys about Hegel or Kierkegaard or Sartre or any of these people. And so that's why I like this novel, that Robinson wants us to know that this is philosophical, that she's engaging with many of the big ideas that all of us think about and grapple with in many of these lineages. And so this is kind of a loose association, but I've mentioned this over in my top 10 Christian novelists work, and I think that everyone should go and read this one. This one is fire, and Robinson is one of the better living authors right now. And so next on our list is another international novel, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. And this one does have a bit of nihilistic aesthetic to it, but in some regard, that's just kind of the Japanese culture, especially of the time. That's just Mishima's little odd brain, or maybe I should say big brain, who knows? And so this novel actually has a lot to do with existentialism and freedom, because on one side in the story, we have a sailor named Ryuji, who has total freedom. He has no family, and he just goes out on the sea as a seaman, as a night watchman or whatever. And he's living this life of freedom, but he has no purpose in it. And so he is depressed. He is melancholic. And so eventually in this, he meets, and these are minor spoilers for like the first quarter of the novel, one could say. I won't spoil the last 3/4 of it. But he meets this woman who he falls in love with, or at least starts to talk to. And she wants him to stop being a sailor and become domesticated to help her in her business. And Ryuji, is a dreamer though deep down. He wants to continue living this fantastical life, and he doesn't know what he wants to give up, and he's grappling with all of this. Then contrast this woman has a son. She's a single mother, and she has a son named Noboru. And I have the crazy story about reading this novel for the first time, if you guys will indulge me for one quick little minute. So I knew a buddy in high school who I was in sports with. And he was always kind of a deviant, getting with a bunch of women, a womanizer. And after high school, we lost contact. I went to Utah for school, and he went somewhere in the South to some university. Years later, I would say about 8 to 9 years after high school, this dude hits me up on Facebook, adds me as a friend, and then instantly after says, bro, I'm at the Santa Fe station. So I grew up in Las Vegas, no longer live there, and I used to live over by this casino called the Santa Fe station. I'm here for a work conference right now. And he was like living at New Orleans at the time. Can I come over on one of my breaks? And I was like, of course, dude. Oh my God, you're here. Sure. And so he comes over and we go swimming. I had a pool and we start talking. And I'm literally reading this book at this time. And he starts telling me that he's started to cheat on his wife and who he has kids with and all this stuff. And he's become kind of this deviant once again. And I was asking him about cheating because he was meeting women online and out in person. And I was like, what do you call yourself? Do you say your name is, let's say his name is Jim, like, hey, I'm Jim? Or do you have an alias? And this dude said his alias was Noboru. And I was like, what? Because in the story, this kid is a sexual deviant who has a peephole and he watches his mom have sex with people. And so anyway, that's a side story. So there's this young demented boy named Noboru in this story, and he's a part of a gang of kids who are these kind of proto-existentialist nihilists who don't get any meaning from any of the codes of our society. Parents, school, religion, government. They don't care about any of that, and they want to live in the moment and experience life in its totality, experience death. They torture cats. They do all this crazy stuff because they're trying to live life without bounds to the fullest. And so this novel is great because we have this existential character, Ryuji, who is falling away from this existentialist lifestyle. And then there's a straight on confrontation with this group that is coming into it. So it's this ultimate, coming of age and fall from grace novel that explodes everyone. Like, if you want to read, this is Mishima's, I think, most popular novel. This is just a really easy one to get into his work. There are some nice flourishes in here, but it's not too philosophical. And so this one, I would say, for a Japanese novel, checks all the boxes. There are some other ones that are more dark, but I would recommend this one because this will open your eyes to Mishima and a whole other world, and it's not that hard of a read. It can be grotesque and dark at times, but it's not over the top. Like, I was contemplating some other Japanese picks, and I was like, ugh. I feel like in the tradition of many of the novels I just talked about, too much violence, too much inwardness, that's suddenly turning into a stream of consciousness, postmodern, nihilistic type novel, which this can feel nihilistic, but who knows? So next we have Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And I first read this in 10th grade in geometry class, which I wasn't doing very good in because my teacher just let me read the entire time. And I was struggling with this work because it is somewhat hard, especially because I was coming into reading and I was trying to figure out what was going on. So I don't know if anybody remembers this, but back in like 2009 or so, there was a service you could text called Cha-Cha where someone real on the other end would be on a computer and would answer your question. So I would type out quotes I didn't understand and some dude, if I was lucky, would give me some interpretation. Did anybody use Cha-Cha back in the day? That was like proto AI, like text a question to someone. Like that's how we used to cheat on tests every once in a while. We would, if it was a 1 out of 10 test, we would all try to text Cha-Cha if we didn't know our question and its answer. And then we'd have a code for whatever it was. Like if we tapped our finger 3 times, it would be B or whatever. Anyway, what was funny about that was that when I was at university, I was taking some Shakespeare class with this try-hard professor, like really hard class in terms of like, we would do quizzes. He didn't let us write papers because, if you let me write a paper, I'll get an A on it. Like I'll send a no life and make it good enough and I'll get the A. This guy he would do these huge lectures and then also like want us to really closely read the work and have these crazy quizzes with like really minute answers. They were really hard. And so one time I had two of my buddies and they're like, Ian, we didn't study for this fucking test. We're screwed. We're not going to get our scholarship. I'm trying to get into this MFA program. I was like, okay, you think I care? Let me help you. And so then I re-employed the system that we were doing in that geometry class, actually, to help them cheat their way to an A. Let's go, everyone. And so what I like this one is not necessarily the God is dead stuff, because that is existential. Okay, what do we do? But the question of what we fill the void with, and the idea of the Übermensch or the Overman is actually somewhat positive. I mean, he is the artist of life. He is the dancing man. He is not restricted. And what makes Nietzsche awesome is that he doesn't go down the consciousness is a curse and sad boy rabbit hole a lot of the time, especially in this novel. He pushes this idea of, vitalist existentialism, if that is correct in this situation, and says that pity, guilt, resentment, passive suffering, all that is for losers. All those lit bro sad boys out there right now, that's not the Overman. That's not it. Because if you think about it, if you think about the next step, or this individual, which maybe is centuries down the line, they aren't going to be this inward moper. They are going to be active. And so this novel is about, sometimes meandering and saying it over and over again. What are you going to do with this newfound freedom? And once again, this is one of the works that really kicked off everything else that everyone picked up later on. And so our last selection of the day. So I couldn't finish this list, and I have so many random people. I mean, what's fun about existentialism, like I was saying earlier, is you can attribute a lot of novels to it, and I've tried to stay within the zone. Maybe Gilead was a little bit of a stretch, but we got to have a stretch pick. But I would say Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse is definitely not. You could even put Damien by him also on this list. I would say that would fit perfectly. And so this novel is about spiritual schizophrenia, about the split, the wild man within and then the rational man, which has been, one of the keys to mythology all throughout time. Dr. Jekyll, the Iron John fairy tale, like we just go on and on about the wild man versus the rational man within, which is basically a discussion on living by the rules and holding back versus freedom. And so I like this one because it also has a positive, hopeful ending and positive ideal that instead of maybe going down the romantic, nihilistic rabbit hole like the Underground Man or some of the other stories, eventually, and I won't spoil it for you guys, the main character reaches a different form of transcendence. What's funny is that it's very in the body and very verb heavy. Some of these things, you dance, you laugh, you cry, you sleep, like all these different things, kind of these physical actions or inactions drive these characters a lot of the time to a unification that wasn't present, because kind of a thing that happens in many existential novels is we have this idea of the split self, of someone suffering from nausea, spiritual crisis, whatever. And eventually that gets thrown into shambles and a decision has to be made. And a lot of the time, existential novels end on this hopeful note of unification. Sometimes they go in the negative, but this is why I don't actually mind the genre very much, because sometimes it can, like a lot of these novels are very dark, but there usually is a thread of hope, which I think is the root of transformative novels, that you can take me on this kind of dark journey, but if there's a payoff at the end and I could see the way through and you offer a literal solution, like this novel has a solution, many of the others have solutions, then I'm okay with it. And so boom, there you guys go. This is it. This is the breakdown. What did I miss? What should I have not put on this list? What was a dumb choice? I would love to hear from you guys. If you guys would like to support me, you can, not just on this channel, but over on my second channel, which is the Literary Renaissance. Over there, I help writers and readers activate so that we can actually make change in the world through literature. It's actually my place where I show you boots on the ground techniques and ideas on how to kind of activate your reading career and you sharing your thoughts to the world, or more so writing and sharing your writing out in the world. And so obviously I have a book club, Instagram, X, whatever. You guys can go support me there. Thank you guys for being here. Hope your day or night goes well. Continue to read, get a little bit done every day, and I'll see you guys very soon in the next video.